The episode you are about to hear was originally recorded at an EMSTU, epic marathon stream at Theory Underground. Theory Underground is a lecture course, ongoing research seminar, and book publishing school buy-in for workers with earbuds and professionals who see no future in existing organizations, institutions, and movements. We are all about trying to understand the situation anew. This requires what Marx called the ruthless critique of everything in existence, including the left, Marxism, politics more generally, church, capital, modern schooling. It's all up for question. Whether you are an atheist or devoutly religious, whether you are in a political movement or party, or are independent, whether right or left or neither left nor right, you're welcome here. If you want to get more involved, there's two main ways to do that. To support the public and free content, you can become a patron over at our Patreon. But if you want to get involved, if you want to have special access to some of the course content that is only for members, or if you are interested in being a part of the discussions or being up for the turn, having us actually read your work, then you'll want to become a subscriber. Go to theoryunderground.com and get involved. Thank you. And we're off. Welcome to the show, Haas. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Fantastic. How do I say your full name?
Haas Aldine, but it's a made-up name, so you could just say Haas. It's not. It's extremely important to get it right.
Okay. Well, I guess the main reason I wanted to bring you here is because for the last year and a half, I've every once in a while had somebody who'll pop up in the chat and say, "You gotta talk to Haas," and we also get people who'll come around and start talking about the CPA. Is that's what it's called, right? Or the APC?
ACP. ACP.
Okay. ACP.
Yeah.
And this is all, I mean, in my kind of world, I've felt very resistant to this kind of communist or socialist kind of branding for a long time, because for me, I was involved with Bernie. I've always liked Marx, knocking on doors, making phone calls. I did not think that this, some kind of an American Communist Party has a hope, right? It doesn't seem to have a hope. And not only does it not seem to have a hope, but to go there, it seems like we're going to have to spend the rest of eternity having arguments about propaganda, messaging, misinformation, and the last 100 to 200 years of history, instead of getting on with some kind of a solution that would work for everybody. And then from my superficial glance at what's going on with your work, you do seem to want to encompass a lot of people. In fact, maybe too many people for your average Democrat. And that's actually something that I find pretty cool about it. But I guess I just want to give you the floor so you can introduce yourself to our audience a little bit and say what it is that you do.
Sure. I'm Haas. I am known for many years for being the host of the Infrared Show. I have an infamous reputation, so to speak. A great proportion of my fame is actually potentially negative. Not necessarily negative, just controversial, I would rather say. And recently, we launched the American Communist Party, which I'm the executive chairman of. And so I go around and I introduce myself now as the executive chairman of the American Communist Party. Very professional, very formal. But before then, I just, what would I say? A host of Infrared Show, I guess.
Yeah. So,
That's
Haz, one of the things I'd like to ask you is is there one thing that stands out to you that people misunderstand about you and what you're trying to do?
Ah, of course. I think this whole sphere is a game of misrecognition, and the misrecognition is inevitable. We have an intention, we have a feeling, an emotion, and or an idea, and we want to communicate it to the public, and it inevitably becomes um, perceived in a way that it's contrary to your original intention or your feeling. But the thing about the infrared collective is that, we are coming from a theoretical background which understood the inevitability of that fact. And so it was a matter of basically controlling how we're misrecognized,
right.
if that makes sense. And you can control it actually, if as long as you understand and can have a pulse on public perception and not the meaning of what you say and as far as your intention is concerned, but the objective meaning, which is, it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to something else, something radically impersonal, something radically indifferent to your subjectivity. And if you could have a kind of grasp of that, I guess people will call it memes or they'll call it something else. If you could have a basic and I'm not saying we're masters of it or I'm a master of it. There's definitely things I still have yet to learn about it. But I think that I've made an earnest effort to try and understand that and humble myself to that. Now, but I think actually the biggest thing people misunderstand me with respect to is that I don't actually confuse this for something personal. I don't turn on my camera and think that, I'm communicating my true authentic self to the world. And I think people, when it comes to the more inflammatory humor and the outrageous kind of infamous reputation I have, I don't think they understand that it's like, oh, does this guy have any self-awareness? And it's like, well, yeah, I have self-awareness of the fact that when I'm on camera, I'm not even really a person. So all this ridiculous stuff is just meant to communicate a basic, I don't know, maybe it's an American thing. I've noticed like Eminem and WWE, it's very much a kind of thing where just like, who gives a shit? It doesn't matter how stupid or ridiculous we look. It's just to get the point across that matters.
Right.
So, but okay, I'm rambling. I think the thing people misunderstand the most about me probably is that they underestimate the extent to which I am radically indifferent to the personal side of this whole thing. And I think and I'm saying that because, a lot of people they kind of attribute to me this reputation of representing some kind of authoritarianism and tanky and Stalinism. And well, actually,
Right.
that's correct. I mean, that's very correct. Uh, but I think the thing people are often off the mark about is probably also I don't it's so polarized. It's like, well, among certain, I guess, I don't know if are they still leftists anymore? I don't know how much things have changed. But they'll kind of run with the accusation that I'm secretly a neo-Nazi or I'm secretly a fascist
Right.
or something, which I, of course, that's a misunderstanding. But is it a misunderstanding or is it just a malicious kind of form of slander that's just meant to damage my reputation on purpose? I don't know. Anyway, I'm not an expert on how I'm perceived. Honestly,
I want to bring in, I guess, part of what I often do whenever I've got Benjamin on here as a co-host. It's usually either Benjamin is the co-host or Nance, but you get to meet all of us, so this is exciting. But one of the things that I'll do is I'll kind of just give my sort of gutsy, vague impression of what's going on the spectacle because I have some kind of an idea because I hear things, I see things. I don't tend to want to dig down any deeper. It's all Baudrillard land, in my opinion. And so
yes.
with right. And so, first of all, I want to acknowledge that
when it comes to meme warfare, which is kind of what we're getting at with this, deliberate misrecognition and trying to use that, it is something that I think that you're undeniably good at. And so I want to first of all acknowledge that you are, if not a real life warlord, you are at least a meme lord. And so you get full points for that. And part of why, obviously, and we haven't said the term yet, but mega communism. You're taking two very controversial terms and you're bringing them together. And you're doing it in a way that makes a lot of people upset because they don't like those two things, or they don't like one of those two things. And the CNN hit piece on you was something that I wanted to actually watch. I wanted to get to, so I don't usually do so much going down the rabbit hole and trying to get to the bottom of the thing, but I was like, shit, if we're going to have Haas on, like I'm going to want to check that out. Right. And so I tried, I actually paid for a month of Max so that I could get, and then they, I think they swapped that episode out with a different one. It's no longer the one that it originally said it would be.
I watched it live and I was live streaming it as well. So that's how I was able to see it. But they interviewed me for an hour or two and none of it came to light. They didn't include any of it. They were going with a very specific angle, I think, which probably my interview did not really, was not very conducive to. That's my interpretation. But, yeah, look, the thing about MAGA communism is that just like Lenin, and I know it's very humble of me to compare myself to Lenin, but just like Lenin and Mao, as a Marxist, I want to follow a tradition of basically having faith in the so-called stupid masses, the peasants, the people that are not necessarily educated, but whose, for some reason, we have faith in their instincts, we have faith in their intuitions, we have faith in their some kind of collective subjectivity that they possess, which goes beyond all of this confusion and lack of education and low consciousness. Lenin hedged his bets on the peasants. Everyone knows that's what distinguished him from the other social democrats. He said, well, we can have an alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry. And everyone said, you're crazy for this. Are you kidding? These peasants, all they're doing is pogroms and they're backward and whatever. And Lenin said, well, that's our only ally. Otherwise, we're done, And then Mao was more radical with respect to this notion of having faith in so-called, from the perspective of intellectuals, at least, stupid people, right? So the victory of MAGA communism, I think, is that the fact that it took off as a meme and it worked as a meme proved that there was something true about it.
Yep.
And the controversy always came when I don't want to be too mean, but I would say they're midwits, when kind of midwits were too presumptuous about what it actually meant. Instead of just trusting the meme, instead of just trusting like, oh, it works as a meme, there's something about this that's true, and radically having a contemplative introspection and thinking about that deeply. They didn't really think about it deeply. They just took it at face value and they're like, well, it's stupid. MAGA's anti-communist. Communism is something else. Or MAGA must be a stand-in for national, and communism must be a stand-in for socialism. It's national socialism. So there wasn't a lot of, I think this is the issue. I think, again, it's a mean term, but I think midwit, no one here is a furry digital artist, are you? I don't want to offend anyone. Well, the equivalent to like
we've banned all furries from TU. Yeah.
Right. Well, like if we think of like high art or like serious artists with like that are taken seriously in the global art world, or sophisticated artists, the kind of midwit version of that is like the furry digital artist, basically, who's like always grandstanding about how, oh, AI is destroying true art. And it's like, well, you're a furry digital artist. I don't know what. Anyway, the intellectual equivalent of that, which tend to lean liberal, I think, and oftentimes describe themselves as leftist, I think they kind of, because it was a meme, they had this arrogance that they didn't have to take it seriously at the level of the intellect. They're like, well, this is a stupid meme. It's stupid. It's like, it's operating at a level of like our most base intuitions and instincts. So I don't need to take this seriously. I'm just going to give this like, 2% of my mental energy and just dismiss it outright. But I think there is a kind of strand within the Marxist tradition, beginning with Lenin or Marx for that matter, frankly, which says actually we need to use the highest faculty of our intellect in order to understand and comprehend stupid things. Because stupid things, however stupid, are more intelligent than the most grand and sophisticated of our thoughts. Why? Because in contrast to our thoughts, they're somehow real. They somehow acquire the status of objectivity. And Marx, what stupid thing did he very much take seriously? Humanity. What's more stupid than, to quote the early Marx in his poems, what I find on the street, your average bum, your average dumb guy on the street. Marx raised that to the dignity of the highest thought, which was at the conclusion of the Hegelian process. So honestly, I think people underestimated MAGA communism, and that's why. But then I'm kind of stupid, and here's why: because I had to do a self-criticism. Not that I regret anything or want to reverse anything, but I think I also underestimated the stupidity of midwits. They are also an objective phenomena. So the reaction and backlash, instead of complaining about how stupid these people are for not getting it, well, of course there are kind of furry digital artists, and they're very numerous, and they do play a big role in defining perception. Journalists and people in academic fields and whatever, they do have an ability to hijack the meme and turn it into something else. But I think MAGA, in general, the meme was victorious despite all of that. But it's one of those things where, like, if you want to set about the process to actually understand it, we have not done a very good. See, I don't know how, if you guys, in Hegel, there's like a distinction between reason and the understanding, right? Like reason is this kind of seamless, seamless flow of, participation of the mind in reality, whereas the understanding has to radically abstract something from its context and actually subject it to some kind of, reflexive, intentional, conscious inquiry, right? And so at the level of the understanding, if you Google MAGA communism, it's like, oh, this is stupid, I'm going to dismiss it, it's meaningless. Mm-hmm. So it's something that still has its potency and power in the reason, right? But at the level of the understanding, it's very difficult to communicate it without, because it's like, if you read my Substack, The Rise of MAGA Communism, it's not something that your average person is going to read and understand. They're going to say, that's a bunch of babble, it's nonsense.
So I want to get into, really quick, I was going to say a little bit more about my impression. Like, I heard Plastic Pills talking about you. I saw kind of the clips people share around of you getting angry at your chat, which, that it's always a matter of time until a streamer has those kind of clips going around. There's a bunch of great ones for me that eventually will circulate.
At my chat. It must be recent.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean that maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it wasn't your chat. Maybe it was something else. I don't know. But the kind of thing that people are gaming for with those is like, oh, it's an aggro bro, and we get called that from time to time. And not Studebaker, of course not. He's no one would ever accuse him of such a thing. But Nance and I, we're roided out, frat bros to some people because we're expressive and there's a little bit of masculinity in our voice still, and so. People don't like that, and that seems to be something that from what I was able to find on CNN's hit piece, which wasn't much. I think that they're trying to frame this as like a toxic, masculine, reactionary movement, and I think I want you to know, first of all, that in this space, on this platform, we don't even have to address that one. It's not even. It doesn't matter. They say the same thing about us, but where I'm interested more is like this contradiction between Dugin and Žižek that Benjamin Studebaker here was talking about in the last episode of Why I Left. He wrote a piece on Dugin versus Žižek and Samuel Huntington, and it's a very interesting thing. We can get into it. But before we get into it, I want to first take a moment to say, look, if people are saying well, there's the red, and that's the communist, and then there's the brown, and that's the MAGA, and then of course, they say that's nationalist, and so it's nationalist socialist. Well, here's the thing though, but you do stuff with Dugin, right? You've
Yeah.
met him, you've talked, and then you do. I've seen clips of you mentioning multipolarity, which is very much like his thing. And I've read the Fourth Political Theory. It's something that I found very interesting in the 2020 when I was burning out from politics and whatnot. I was looking for something new, so of course I went to Dugin. And I, among others, like the Platypus Affiliated Society, Benjamin's old podcast, What's Left, back when, at the time that I was coming to it, he was no longer there. But this is, to me, the terrain of competing sort of heterodox ideologies, people who realize that Democrats and Republicans and the United States empire, it's not the end of history, and it's also not going to get any better from here, right? And so I'm interested in all that, but I guess I want to give you a moment to address the Dugin thing, because he was the founder of a national Bolshevik party. He was a red-brown, and so if you're associating with him, of course, people who think mega communism, red-brown, they see you associate with him, they're going to draw the connections. It doesn't take a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, I mean, look, I know what it looks like. I guess I was there too. I mean, in 2016, 2015, I was buying into this stuff about Dugin as well. And no, I mean, where to begin? I think, Dugin actually took interest in the MAGA communism idea. The MAGA communism idea, I don't think that came from Dugin on my part. My interest in Dugin began in 2018, 2019, and it was actually a radical critique of America and American universalism. And at that point, I had no faith in any kind of American, a redemption of America. I had the belief that this is an artificial nation and it's completely fake and contrary to the laws governing the development of civilizations and nations even. So I think the MAGA communism thing, in terms of what I was inspired by, it's a very specific reading of Marxism-Leninism that my collective acquired, which understood the conflicts within Marxism, because a lot of people think Marxism is this like doctrine and there's just these various additive elaborations based on new circumstances. But what they often neglect is that these came within the context of very fierce contentions and disputes and fights, to the point where, I mean, it could sometimes lead to armed clashes, people trying to kill each other over this stuff. And so, the question is, what is the essence of Marxism-Leninism? What is the thing that's constantly stringing the process along? And I'm simplifying it, of course, but it's always a moment which, more refined thinkers who are from the milieu of Žižek and the French school, which we came from, by the way, will probably look at Marxism-Leninism and dismiss it as a kind of mockery of the intellect in the service of authoritarian regimes, right? So it's just molding ideas to suit the whims and fancies of power. But I think what they looked over is that the nature of the power in question is something radically new, and is by no means some kind of banal, cynical, eternal, exercise of greed and power or whatever, but represents a radically new form of statehood, new form of state existence, which is somehow, how should I put it? This sounds idealistic, but for lack of a better word, cognizant of in the sense of like the Hegelian self-consciousness, right? Somehow cognizant of laws of history, which it integrates not as ideas or thoughts, but as real material structures of governance and authority and power. And Marxism-Leninism was very, however simple, it was this radical index of the changes and developments happening at that level. Actually, it began with an understanding of the Bolshevik Party and an inquiry into how that party formed, what actually led it to power, what was decisive, what were they fighting with everyone else about, what was the big topic. And the basic dynamic we kind of started to learn about is that in Marxism, some kind of heterodox Marxist, cognizant of the laws of history and faith, having some kind of faith in them and the inevitable victory of socialism or communism, takes a radical risk that is not preempted by the form of Marxism. It is an imperilment of the entire enterprise of Marxism in the content of a radically new terrain, right? So in Lenin's case, that was the Russian peasant. Marxism had nothing about the Russian peasant, right? It was a completely uncharted territory. But Lenin risked everything on this idea of the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. And it's what distinguished the entire Bolshevik Party, and it serves as the foundation of Leninism itself. Stalin likewise did this with his notion of socialism in one country. Again, radically unprecedented. What, we're going to construct and build socialism out of Russia? Russia is Timbuktu from the Marxist perspective. It's a radically alien, foreign civilization. I mean, Marx was the culmination of Europe. He was the culmination of, French materialism and German idealism and the whole development of early modernity, and the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. And Russia, that's something else, right? It's Mars. So a huge risk was taken under Stalin's leadership to view Russia as a context for the construction, the alternate, as Lenin, to quote Lenin, the alternate construction of a modern civilization. And then Mao, I think that it goes deeper, right? As far as this radical faith in the masses. So we were able to somehow discern from this a conclusion with respect to a dynamic we were starting to notice in the information age, which is the phenomena of populism. This clash between this wild form of popular sovereignty, which is primarily somehow acquiring a cybernetic form through alternate media and social media, versus expert institutions that rule on the basis of, democratic consensus and credibility and legitimacy. And we notice that the Marxists of our age tend to side with the institutions. They side with the experts. They side with the form. And we decided this is not in the spirit of the history of Marxism, that a radical risk needs to be taken to derive a new meaningfulness of Marxism within the context of this new cybernetic populism, whatever to call it. And that's not because we're saying that populism is inherently good. The Russian peasants weren't inherently good. Sometimes they carried out pogroms.
But what about
yeah.
What about? So I think you're about to tie this back to the question about Dugin, but I just want to make sure that how does American populism, or if we could talk about something beyond America, just this rise in populism, how does that have anything to do with Dugin?
Yeah, good question. I think my interpretation is this. I think that after the end of the USSR, the institution of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union collapses. The institution of Soviet statehood collapses. By the way, in China, something similar happened with the Cultural Revolution, but that ended up reinvigorating the state power and giving it a new dynamic form, which is why China survived. But then the Russian people were left with this kind of existential confrontation of, okay, that institution, that was the form of Soviet civilization or communism. Well, what about the content? What actually survived and endured that? Is there any redemption or hope for us, the Russian people, after our state is gone and it is collapsed? So that was the context, I think, of National Bolshevism. And National Bolshevism was deliberately provocative, and the flag looks like it does deliberately, because that was Limanov's trolling of the various liberal forces in Russia in the time, the post-90s period, who were fear-mongering about how, because there was a power vacuum in Russia at the time, some rogue people from the former KGB or the military or something are going to implement fascism. And there was this new interpretation of Soviet history, that Stalin was a red fascist and that fascism is the big boogeyman. So Limanov, that was his response, basically, was... But the National Bolsheviks did. There was this new punk rock kind of nationalist wave that they tapped into. Did they get to the level of neo-Nazism? No. I think neo-Nazism was a distinct phenomenon. But the provocative and edgy aspect was not Dugin's creation. Dugin was involved in some of that stuff in the 80s, I believe. He was flirting explicitly with this kind of mystical fascism.
Right.
But if you read between the lines, he's not giving an actual endorsement of the Nazis. The fascism they were talking about was a boogeyman that was created by put it this way, in the same way Starship Troopers is called fascist, like this vague cosmetic, George Lucas, where Darth Vader, this vague one where it's just like, it just represents this kind of illiberalism and irrationalism and authoritarianism. So in the same way that liberal intellectuals recklessly accuse things that are not inherently fascist of being fascist, these circles in Russia at the time, before the National Bolsheviks, I should say, were also flirting with it in the same way. But then they would say, of course, we reject Hitler and we reject the racialism, and they said, but we just like, the aesthetic, and it was very superficial, very Dugin had a piece, he called it Fascism Borderless and Red. And that seems enough to indict him as having at least been a fascist before the fourth political theory. But if you actually read it, he's like, actually, the Nazis and Mussolini was not real fascism. That was just capitalism. And their racialism should be fully condemned, and their crime should be condemned. But the real thing is this like mystical, vague. So he wasn't really... I don't think it would be fair to say he was a fascist. I think it was a series of provocations and our liberties that these circles were taking. Now, National Bolshevism, I think, was something else. I think that was not necessarily Dugin's brainchild, but Dugin definitely was one of the big figures involved in that originally in the 90s. But in Russia, I mean, look, I went to Russia and I asked people, I was like, look, why did the flag look like that? Because you know how that looks, because I always, in America, get called an Osbo. I'm like, what? So what's the deal with this? And they were like, this was just trolling. They literally said it's trolling. And they said the Nazbols after the 90s were actually like ultra-left anarchists in the Russian context. They were considered ultra-leftists. The difference between them and the KPRF was that the Nazbols were like, how should I say, punk rock. Instead of a formal party that's respectable and it's official and whatever, they were just kind of, more young and more... They were ultra liberal though in their cultural orientation. They weren't conservatives. All these, it's very difficult to communicate, because it's like a lot of people, when they hear Nazbol in the US, they're like, oh, this is combining cultural conservatism with left-wing economic views. But like, that wasn't the Nazbols. The Nazbols actually were bohemians who were radically liberal in their cultural orientations. very much like the American punk rock anarchists or something. So it's difficult. Anyway, I know I'm rambling a lot.
No, you're doing great. Yeah, you're doing great. And I think I know that Benjamin had a question. I do want him to be able to ask it, and then I think we'll come back because I've got like this whole stack here, man. But there's no rush. We've got some time here. So Benjamin, you take it away.
Yeah. So as I listen to your answers, you have suggested that you identify with Stalinism. You've suggested that Maoism goes beyond or was more radical than Stalinism. And then you also suggested that through the digital, there is a kind of populism or perhaps a kind of state form now that is achievable that wasn't achievable in the past. And I wonder, why do we talk about Stalinism and Maoism if what you're really interested now is something specifically digital?
I think it's because I'm beginning from a very it's so bad because a lot of like the foundation of where I'm coming from are like just unreleased books that I've written for my own personal satisfaction where I'm like, aha, finally. But then I was like, well, I'm not ready to release this to the public. It still needs some more work. But like I proceed, like I made the breakthrough, now I could take it for granted. And but everyone in the public is like, what the hell? Where's this guy coming from? But any case, it began with a radical interpretation of the October Revolution as not just some isolated incident of a workers' uprising somewhere that happened to be successful, but a world historical, how should I put it, objective change in history that signified a post-liberal era. And when I say liberal, I'm talking about a classical form of statehood and a form of modern politics that's based on the rule of institutions, and moreover, institutions which interpolate individuals as discrete political subjects in the form of individual citizens with individual rights, and a notion of collective existence and sociality by extension, which is based on contractual association between these sovereign individual subjects or atoms. So it is a kind of modern atomism that parallels Newtonian physics, if you want to really read into the metaphysical background of classical liberalism. Hobbes and Newton are bedfellows, right? 100%. So to me, the October Revolution happens in 1917. Also, simultaneously, there are radical disturbances happening at the level of physics as well, which disturb the stoic and sovereign form of the atom, the particle, in a similar fashion, I think. And this gave rise to an understanding subjectively in the form of Marxism-Leninism, and objectively in the form of these new states, proletarian dictatorships, communist states. The most prominent one that survives today being China, which also has played a very important role in this transformation to the information age, I think. But in any case, there's this objective understanding of Bolshevism and communism and Leninism we have, which is, it's not just a subjective principle. It's not just an ideology. It represents a radical and world historical change in terms of the nature of how states function. And that's a reflection of the breakdown of the classical, at least the classical form of capitalism. Now, Lenin understood that as imperialism, the highest stage. Later, Michael Hudson understands super-imperialism, which is the American era of imperialism, which is a different system. But a shocking provocation we don't repeat very publicly anymore, that we have communicated before as infrared, is the idea that what if this signifies the objective dissolution of the capitalist mode of production? And before the Middle Ages, before feudalism officially announced its destruction to the world, capitalism had already taken hold. It predominated over the feudal mode of production, even while there were kings and there were feudal laws on the books, and there were kingdoms and peasants and serfs. This new logic of production started to take hold, right? At the objective level of civil society, at the base. So we thought maybe something like this is happening with respect to the triumph of socialism. It isn't just the Soviet Union that brought socialism to the world. Alexander Kojev, had a very shocking provocation. He said Henry Ford was the truest Marxist of the 20th century. Well, you could see how Fordism is a new logic of production than the classical form of capitalism described by Marx. We may not agree on the terminology of, is that the form of socialism in civil society taking hold? Who knows, right? But that's a thesis or hypothesis we've put out there. But we got a lot of flack for it because people read into it. They were saying, "Oh, so you're saying that the world is socialist? You're saying America is socialist? That means you endorse America?" And it's like, well, we don't mean at the level of the superstructure. We mean at the level of civil society. Some change has happened. In any case, let me skip to the part about digital. This is where I mean to talk about it. The institutions of liberalism, which reflected modern capitalism, are breaking apart at the seams. And they're being replaced at the level of civil society, not necessarily by new institutions, but by a new logic of collective existence and representation. And that is the cybernetic, form of social media and stuff that we're describing.
Right.
And so to ask the question, why Stalin, why Mao, and why Lenin, and so on, well, here's an interesting idea. What if they could be understood in some sense as the forefathers of this new era of civilization that we're entering into, that they represented this triumphant, construction of grand states, which was a great deal of subjective willpower and whatever, and so on. But what if they actually won? What if China won? What if we're actually living in some kind of post-capitalist world objectively, and these things we're seeing at the level of civil society represent the consolidation of that fact? And that is something interesting to think about. And if you understood it in this way, if you understand it in this way, what is the relation between cybernetic populism and Maoism or Leninism? I think the relation is as follows. They represent symptoms within civil society that reflect how the Marxist-Leninist tradition reflect wisdoms that were already in the Marxist-Leninist tradition. As far as, it's not to say Marxism-Leninism will never change or advance in any kind of way, but so far this represents a wisdom of statecraft which seems to be attuned and cognizant of the various contradictions that are now driving society crazy, with the kind of this conflict between a hyper-polarized, battle between cybernetic populists and institutions. And it's like, well, how do we construct a state that can understand these contradictions, can be cognizant and respond to them? That's the word I want to use, respond to these contradictions. And, well, it's not necessarily our thesis. This book here is called The Communist Postscript by Boris Groys. And he proposed the radical idea that, similar to this, that Marxism-Leninism represented this communism, represented, instead of the rule of money, he said it was the rule of language. It is the fulfillment of the Platonic, ideal of the philosopher king and so on. But it's like, if you understand language in the sense of social media or in the sense of the information age, it can yield some interesting ideas and thoughts and reflections, I think. Like we are now experiencing problems that only a proletarian dictatorship could even make sense of and respond to. A lot of people point to similarities between Mao's Cultural Revolution and the rise of, the student. This was in 2016, and granted, the rise of like the cancellation culture and all this kind of stuff. But it's like, but the difference is Mao's Cultural Revolution was an intentional ideological kind of thing. It was a phenomena with an idea, but this is not that. This is just an objective symptom. This is a symptom of something objective at the level of civil society. So how does this tie together with Dugin, I think? Well, I've done the impossible by tying it together just now, because it's not easy to do. But I think I can say something that will make sense. A lot of Dugin's his project is oriented toward the rediscovery of how should I put it? Distinct forms of collective and civilizational existence that are not reducible to the Western or European logos. And he has this idea that, of course, there are different logoi. Sorry, I don't know how to say it. The plural of logos.
Right.
Logoi, something like that. I think from a materialist perspective, you can probably interpret the Western logos to be the global institutions of liberalism that were the culmination of, this kind of classical liberal Anglo-Saxon era of world history, right? And what form of collective existence persists and perseveres in the midst of the breakdown of the modern institutions of liberalism or modern institutions of statehood in general? So the Soviet state collapsed, but did Soviet civilization collapse? Were there irreversible things about the Soviet experience that made that such that it's not possible to go back to, I don't know, some kind of liberal democracy or something? Well, clearly it's not possible if you look at today's Russia. And I think a lot of Dugin's thinking is aimed around addressing this fact. So far from being a kind of fascist adjacent thinker, I think he is probably best understood as a thinker who bears much more proximity to a post-communist era. And when I say post-communist, I don't necessarily mean like anti-communist, but just like, what are the existential implications we can draw from the collapse of liberalism in the 20th century and, the rise of these not necessarily communist, even just illiberal poles around the world, right? And whether they're in the Islamic world or, and Dugin himself is not, right now at least, too interested in Marxism. I think that he is now interested in Hegel, more interested in Hegel. He's writing a book on Hegel. And, I'm someone who will be meeting him soon, I believe. And so the Marxist lobby is here with me. But no, I think he's open to it, though. He is open. The Marxism he doesn't that he rejects is the official Soviet form. Because, right. Well, you can't blame him because the Soviet Union collapsed, right? So if there's a Marxism today, it needs to somehow acknowledge that fact. It can't just dwell in delusion and say, oh, there's nothing that happened. It needs to take into account how is it that the Soviet state, managed to collapsed, such that all we're left with now is the Russian people. Like, however imperfect they are, however whatever, this is what you're left with. You cannot wield the authority of Soviet statehood over the world or over the Russian people anymore because it's gone, right? But the old official Marxism only had credibility because it was tied to power, right? Because it was tied to that authority, but now that authority is gone, right? So it's that kind of institutional Marxism, which my interpretation is the legacy of Western social democracy and Kautsky's orthodox Marxism, his project of making Marxism an orthodoxy. Not necessarily that there's something wrong with that, but that specific form of Marxism, which, you know, has this notion of progress, where if you're England, you're the most advanced, and if you're Russia, you are, you know, backward and so on.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that makes sense that you would have that criticism of Kautsky. It also makes sense then that you would regard the Soviet Union, since it failed, as having had problems in the way in which it developed the theory. What about China? Do you regard China as having the social structures that correspond with the kind of digital populism that you think is the future? Or do you regard China as also in some way having deviated, for instance, by going into the agreement with Nixon in the 70s?
I think that what I like about China in the 70s is not necessarily the geopolitics, which are, I mean, I can't blame them because the Soviets were very aggressive toward China at that time, and they were trying to bully them, and they thought China's isolated. They have no friends. What are they going to do? So I don't blame them, but what I like is the realism. I like this radical and ruthless realism that China began to adopt, which was, it seems like the antipode and the complete antithesis of the Cultural Revolution, which is hyper ideology. But it was actually just the dialectical supplement or complement, I would say, that was developing alongside the radical ideologism of the Cultural Revolution. So too arose this radical and ruthless realism, which I think was there in Marxism from the beginning, but was somehow lost. And China's hyper-realism, whatever we want to call it, where, you know, there is an objective nature of statecraft and of international relations that is irreducible to ideology. And I think there's a common theme you might be discerning here, right? There's an objective, for example, there's an objective triumph of socialism, regardless of whether the institution of, you know, the state is gone or collapses. There is a new logic that's objective taking hold. And this is the realism I think China adopted at the time. And realism is not necessarily cynicism. It's also called in Marxism materialism, right? But in any case, I don't blame China for the decisions they made in the 70s and that period. Although China did not, they really China, okay, I don't want to say something offensive. China had some kind of Oedipal relationship to the Soviet Union because the Soviets gave China the logos of communism, so to speak. So all the original foundation of the construction of the Chinese the People's Republic of China, that was constructed with the direct assistance of Moscow, right? They sent engineers, they sent specialists. The Chinese communists were trained in Moscow. They were, I mean, the Soviet Union was like it was a holy land for the Chinese communists, right? It was like it was the big invincible power. So when they ended up having grievances with the Soviets, it took on a quite Oedipal form, actually, like a disappointment in a father, kind of. You want to rebel against them and whatever. But the Chinese did not anticipate that the orientation of history was going in a direction such that the actual Soviet state is going to collapse. This is why in the 80s, granted, this was after the fervor of the Cultural Revolution, but in the 80s, Deng Xiaoping, when he was seeing what was going on, he was like, wait a second, we had our differences with the Soviets and we made many moves to protect ourselves from them, but we didn't actually want them. We didn't want, the Warsaw Pact to disappear. We didn't want capitalism to triumph, and we didn't actually want these states to disappear. And so they started sending letters to the heads of the states in the Warsaw. They said, listen, your countries need changes. I mean, we've had differences, but listen, you're going way too far with this reforms you're doing and this liberalism and stuff. And so that was the Chinese view. And then now, no, it's rather interesting because China does have a digital populism, which corresponds to the Xi Jinping era of rule. I mean, and people think China is an extremely inorganic, controlled country because of the censorship. The censorship is very superficial. The censorship is overt. It's like, okay, you can say things, you can't say things. But people also underestimate how much Eastern civilizations are self-censorious. They don't necessarily want to say everything. And when they do say things, there's an expectation that it's not just my individual opinion. I am making a partisan statement with respect to the nature of all our collective existence. So there's much more serious weight given to the expression of speech in Eastern societies in general. So censorship in China is not a big controversy in China, from what I can appraise, talking to.
I would just throw in that it's been pretty mixed in my encounters with Chinese people as far as whether it's a big deal or not. And I've gotten the impression that, there's Chinese people who kind of admire something about the American way of life, and so for them, of course, it's not a great thing. And then, but the people for whom it's not a big problem are these more upper middle class people attending conferences saying, well, yeah, you can use a VPN to get around that. It's not a problem. And so there's I'm very curious to hear Benjamin's follow-up question on China, but I did want to say really quick though that I will want to get into I agree that there are objective situations that there's a there we can actually talk about, right? Like not everything's postmodern. There are fundamental changes in the structure of class society, and that 1917 was a serious indication of one of those changes. And I want to talk about how I tend to approach this, right? There's something between Ehrenreich and Burnham that I'm interested in here, and that the 1917 is a sign of, but more importantly, there's the ways that the U.S. reacted to 1917 that, to me, is like the last couple of nails in any serious kind of possibility for a Marxism in the 21st century. The 20th century is the story of Marxism being closed off. That there's not a real path forward. I understand this is controversial, especially with your audience, but I'll just say, to me, this contradiction comes down to one between a sort of Western Marxism and a kind of Eastern Marxism. You keep saying Eastern this and Eastern that, and I understand my main sources are Western and not just the Marxist ones. You and I share a love of some kind of a love for Heidegger, right? But for me, it's also Levinas and Baudrillard and Bourdieu and these guys. But all of them in their own ways are getting at something that the traditional Marxist account wasn't thinking or not able to see. And what I've found interesting about your approach is an attempt to reintegrate a lot of that into some kind of a Marxist-Leninism, which is interesting. I want to come back to that whole trajectory, though. And for now, bookmark it. I've been streaming for 10 hours. We officially hit the 10. It's been 10 hours and 1 minute. I haven't actually eaten more than like 3 carrots today. This has been an awesome stream. I am following. My laser focus is on everything you're saying. Absolutely. But I realized Benjamin and Nance really haven't gotten a chance to really say their things. And I was like, you know what? There's a burrito place a block away. I'm going to listen and walk on over and get a burrito and come back and hang out because, but really quick, folks, we're going to run a short little commercial about these EMSTUs, Epic Marathon Streams at Theory Underground. I'm going to run a quick little commercial. We'll talk on the back end. We'll be right back right after this. Don't go anywhere.
It's a theoretically correct title.
EMSTUs, the Epic Marathon Streams at Theory Underground. EMSTUs.
They bring joy to audiences.
Bring together a wide variety of people who are critical of power, of the state, of capital, but they're not just standard left. This is a place for people who are second guessing, working through things, questioning, and even if they're not, then they're willing to talk to people wwho are, because ultimately Theory Underground is for workers with earbuds getting into theory. The people who are turning to theory because they're saying, well, none of this really makes sense or it's not really working. So there's got to be something more. That's what this is all about. We love to do these and we go hard. The longest EMSTU we've done consecutively was 17 hours. Now we're doing another one. Say hello in the chat and keep it playing in the background throughout the day to boost the stream. Don't bother liking or commenting or subscribing though, because that doesn't actually help us, not one bit. It doesn't help us at all. It's not helpful, not one bit. Do not click the like button. Do not subscribe. If you like this kind of content, it's best to just turn it off and never look at it again. Definitely don't teach the algorithm that you like it. Definitely don't share it with your friends. And of course, just turn it off as soon as possible. That's the biggest help. Thank you.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place for workers with earbuds who are tired of letting others read and think on their behalf, slipstreaming our way into an understanding of the situation that short-circuits the deadlocks of our moment.
Research at Theory Underground focuses on what is most important for understanding our current situation: theory of the subject, capital, time-energy theory, critical media theory, CMT, and the most essential critiques necessary for understanding why the theory, ideology, and common sense of influencers left to right misses the mark.
Theory Underground is coming to a city near you. What that has meant in the last year is traveling across the United States, into Canada, and then all over Europe to promote our books, courses, and ideas related to time energy and underground theory.
We're back. Everybody, I wasn't going to let that PSA play all the way. It's like 6 freaking minutes long. Of course not. But like I said, I'm going to go grab a burrito. I am listening, and I'm very excited because we'll be joined by Michael Downs of The Dangerous Maybe to talk about the fault line theory of the internet, Nick Land versus Slavoj Žižek, the CCRU versus the Ljubljana School, and how Dugan fits into these contradictions. We'll have a lot of fun. Haas just said he will be sticking around for that conversation and to meet Mikey in about 20 minutes here. And so, awesome. But with that, I'll turn it over to you guys. Take it away.
Oh, hey, Dave. What are you up to?
Hello. I'm grading right now. So.
Grading? Well, what's that?
Oh, this? This is a G2 pen. It might be the best pen in the entire world because the price point is perfect for working class people like us. More importantly, cartridges are replaceable. The ink, it glides, but it doesn't smudge too bad. And most importantly, you can do that. And it's really fun.
That's pretty cool.
We at Theory Underground are not sponsored by Pilot, nor does Pilot endorse this commercial. Theory Underground is funded by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm interested to pick up this question of Chinese institutions and how Chinese institutions tap into what you were talking about at the very beginning, which is the stupid, uneducated person. how do Chinese institutions know what's going on with the stupid, uneducated person and act on the basis of that in a way that Western liberal institutions are unable to do? What's the mechanism for that?
Well, I think that China is, I think that it's definitely not just in this form of cybernetic populism. I don't know to what extent rural China is involved. This is just a level of ignorance on my part. I have seen that their version of TikTok, rural China is very prominent there. But I think that that has more to do with Xi Jinping as a political leader. And through classical and more conventional, it seems like, means of driving change and reform, the party has become more receptive to rural China in terms of, the poverty alleviation campaigns, the anti-corruption campaigns of listening to rural people's concerns about corruption and uneven development. And that has all been done at the institutional level of the Communist Party and the people's government. Simultaneously, though, there's this new kind of national sentiment or national feeling, we should rather call it maybe, which is being reflected at the cybernetic level, but which is not necessarily uneducated people, because China, when the average Chinese netizen, I think, is rather educated, just because China is a highly educated country in general. It very much, to be uneducated is not the norm, because education is the way out of, an average life. Well, for most places in the world, but also education is tied to reputation. It's tied to your social status. It's tied to your standing. So even the sons and daughters of farmers in China are educated, and I think with respect to that, there is not as much of an acute division between as exists in China and the United States, where people are educated, but the institutions are so heavily polarized and untrustworthy that people would rather rely on their stupidity, so to speak. They trust their stupid instincts. I don't call them stupid because I'm a good Hegelian. I believe that objective intelligence out there in reality is the world spirit has a plan or something. I can elaborate on that if I am at gunpoint. But in China, that I don't think that contentiousness is necessarily there, because Chinese institutions, it's very interesting. On an institutional level, China is less ideological than the U. It's less contentious. It's more unbiased, and in my estimation, it doesn't have this kind of political correctness. It doesn't really have this, this hiding behind your partisan political views on the basis of expert knowledge that's highly contentious. Like, for example, I know we're on YouTube, the big COVID thing that happened in 2019, 2020, they didn't really have an equivalent of that, because I think the nature of China's institutions already is such that people do not feel aggrieved by the expertise of experts. They don't feel like it's secretly disguising this alien, I'll give you a prominent example of this, which is in the realm of medicine. Many Chinese people do not trust modern medicine, and they still decide to use traditional medicine. And this is a very widespread social phenomenon. So how do China's institutions respond? They say, you know what, we probably should maybe take traditional medicine a little more seriously than we do, or than the West tells us to. We should have a combination. We should have a dialogue. And there's an extreme level of sensitivity and responsivity to national sentiment, to popular sentiment, that In America, institutions, and this is true of liberalism in general, but institutions are the only form of real collective existence that's acknowledged. Okay, this institution validates that we are collective. This institution, whether through a constitution or through a document or a contract, this is a definite association of individuals. Also elections, right? We're going to literally count the decision of individuals, what their choice is, and that's the institution of democracy. But China doesn't reduce collective existence to institutions. It also recognizes that institutions come from the people. So it's called the People's Republic of China. And what's the difference between a People's Republic and a bourgeois republic, so to speak? A People's Republic has an understanding of that there is a collective existence, there is a popular reality that is not premised by our institutions, and we have to acknowledge it and recognize it, and we all do implicitly. We ask the question, who are the people? What people? That kind of question in China is kind of insane. What do you mean, who are the people? The people is this super individual subject, so subject, object, both kind of, that is the acknowledgement of which and the reference toward which is the beginning of meaningful political communication. There's no meaningful political communication if we're not going to acknowledge that we share this reality that is beyond any one individually. And we don't need to define it. We don't need to reduce it to a definition. It can be referenced as an object, and it works, and it makes sense. And that's China. And that's why a lot of people press me on Heidegger, and they're like, what do you mean Heidegger? Heidegger's, was a Nazi. And I'm like, well, look at the description I just gave China. How but through Heidegger can we make sense of that? How can we make sense of this strange subject-object, syzygy or whatever, which is the premise of existence, but is not itself premised by the products of that existence? Kind of sounds like a Heidegger's Dasein, but don't shoot me. It's just...
As I'm listening, I'm thinking about Rousseau and Hegel and the notion of society, right? In a lot of Western political theory, there isn't just the individual, there's the individual in society. And this notion that the state has to in some way correspond with or represent society. And then there's a question of mechanisms for ensuring that there is that correspondence. So I think for a lot of Western thinkers, there is a goal of having the state correspond to something other than individuals, and to not identify the individual straightforwardly with state institutions, but to say that there's some kind of society notion. And maybe neoliberalism has gotten away from this and kind of buried it. But certainly within the French and German, liberal traditions, there is this notion of society, which is not reducible to individuals, but also not identical to state institutions. So I guess my thought would be, is there a particular procedural mechanism or some kind of way in which China guarantees that the state reflects the people? And what would that be, and why is that mechanism better than? And I'm perfectly open to the idea that it might be, because I think our elections are rancid in all kinds of ways and dysfunctional in all kinds of ways. Is there a way in which the Chinese state secures that continuing relationship to the people that we can learn from, that is this innovation, that is the thing that is growing and developing amidst this, otherwise liberal democratic world order?
No, yeah, that's a really good question. Now, with respect to the European Enlightenment, no, you're right. And I think that was implicit. I think Hegel would look at the liberals of the 20th century and think they're crazy for calling things into question, which they just, Hegel, Rousseau, and even Locke, and the thinkers of classical liberalism did not call into. Of course, there's a society. What are you, crazy? But I think that capitalism and liberalism both evolved to a point, a kind of madness where the question actually became posed though. Like, okay, but what is society? How can we be certain that society exists? And that's been called into question. And when that was called into question, we get Margaret Thatcher, who came with the brilliant and genius insight that, well, hey, society doesn't actually exist. It's just individuals. And you're right, that was neoliberalism. But that was because they had to call into question that implicit common sense. And because liberal ideology, I don't think, could really give an answer for what tangibly and discreetly that is, the conclusion was basically arrived at that, well, there is no society. It's a superstition. Now, how does China differ from that? How does China avoid that pitfall? Well, I think the difference is the square one of China's state logic, the proletarian dictatorship, is a commitment to the people, commitment to a form of collective existence whose existence is not actually called into question. And so there's a logic there which can be summed in Mao's phrase, which is trust in the people. If you think about it, trust in the people could mean many, many things that came from Mao. It can mean, let's trust the people's wisdom. Let's trust the people's good instincts. But there's also another way you can interpret it, maybe, which is an epistemic proposition. Let's trust in that we can know the existence of the people, that they exist. We don't need to subject it to some kind of definite procedure in which they only exist if they conform to a certain inflexible standard or criterion, such that they're tangible. It's like the people are the premise of our existence. It's the premise of our ability to communicate, to have language. And that is not called into question. Similarly, like the one China policy, not called into question what constitutes China itself, for example. So these non-negotiables, I think, are very important in the logic of proletarian dictatorship, that we're not actually going to do the absurd, which Heidegger identified as absurd. We're not going to treat being as a being, so to speak. We're not going to do the absurd thing and treat our shared collective existence as somehow reducible to the product of our individual activity. So that is a very important distinction. It's also something that boggles people's minds as China's governance system. Why are there two powers? Why is there simultaneously something called the people's democracy, which is the national government, and the party, the Communist Party? But it's only really, it's 8 parties, but only one party leads the nation, right? Why is that? What's the point? Why not just have one government? Why have this recognition of the party on the one hand and the form of the republic, the democracy on the other hand? And I think it's because another advance over liberalism, I think, is the understanding of the inherently partisan nature of state dictatorship. The real dictatorship of the state is a party. It's not just a republic or a neutral institution of some kind. No, it is a party that does have an agenda, that does have goals. Now, what are those goals? Again, the goal is, the official slogan they'll say is the development of the common prosperity and happiness of the Chinese people, and so on, which sounds very vague and meaningless to us. But I think it is meaningful when you consider the fact that in the US, no such goal binds anyone in politically. There's no obligation or responsibility. There's no partisan obligation or responsibility to actually serve the common good in the US, even according to the form of our republic. The founders intended our republic to fulfill the common good and so on, but that was never that was never binding expressly, in a partisan way, in a way that's politically contentious and divisive. And where's the divisiveness and contentiousness within China coming from? Well, first, China does have different social interests and formations. If any one of these interests, private interests, gain supremacy over the state, there goes that binding responsibility to serve the common good. So those need to be kept at bay. Billionaires in China need to be put in their place. They need to be highly controlled and monitored, and so on and so on.
That's probably my favorite thing about whenever people are talking about how bad China is, and then they say that they punish their billionaires. I'm always just like, well, I'm not sure there's a problem with that. That might be the good part. I'm not sure, but I'm about to get the burrito and be right back. This segment we'll go slightly over on this segment. I wanted to make sure that Nance has an opportunity to say something before this segment's over, though. That's why I'm interjecting here from the street. But yeah. Nance, take it away.
Well, just a final thing. Sorry, I don't mean to ramble, but to directly answer your question, how do you have procedures which can ensure that we can be certain that you're reflecting the will of the people? I think we need to evaluate that subject, the people, and that's what we need to think about. Because in some sense, there is no way to have certainty at all, right? But all that is necessary is that people recognize that very super individual and impersonal collective subject, the people, and recognize that its interests are in fact being fulfilled and responded to. Now, of course, there are mechanisms, very sophisticated and elaborate ones within China, which acquire data, which acquire input, which acquire responsivity from people at the most local levels. One of the things I like about China's dictatorship, party dictatorship, is a structure of democracy that is, they call it the birthday cake structure, right? Where it's several layers of delegation before you get to the very top. So instead of just having, you directly elect the leader from the bottom, because most people are so far removed from leadership at the top that it kind of makes more sense that, okay, well, I know my local community and I know who's doing what there, so we're going to elect him. But then the guy from my local community, one step up, let's say a municipality of multiple villages or something, he's going to meet with other delegates and they're going to make it. So it gradually it's that birthday cake structure, kind of like that kind of hierarchy. And I think that combines the need to have expertise and people who know what they're doing with sensitivity and responsivity to the lowest levels of life and popular sensibility. And I think China does a good job of going full circle, such that this is not guaranteed that there's always going to be a Mao or a Xi Jinping. Sometimes you get a Hu Jintao, not very exciting or particularly groundbreaking, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But a Xi Jinping is somebody who then goes full circle and ensures that at the very top you have a perspective that is so holistic and so far-sighted that you are not thinking about yourself, you're not thinking about your family, you're not thinking about anyone within your personal proximity. You are thinking of the people, the real people, the farmers. You're thinking about what you need to do to ensure their best interest. And these are the people the most alienated from your immediate proximity. There's something very interesting about that. Something very interesting about when you get to the top of the birthday cake, somehow that can be conducive to a perspective, a sagacious Stalinist perspective, where genuine care and concern and consideration can be held for hundreds of millions of people that you will never meet, but you can somehow acquire this radically impersonal, radically, you can even be cold in some sense, perspective, which is thinking about the interests of everybody and not one person and not a group of people, but really the whole people, right? as this radically impersonal subject of politics. People who don't have institutional representation. People, what is the people? Is it the sum total of individuals, or can it also refer to an existence that our political power and state and ideology and consciousness will never have the power to control and define fully? That there's something about them that pre-exists that fact. And to be a wise, sagacious king means, when you're serving the interests of the people, it means mercy toward that, mercy toward this existence. Don't punish people for not living up to the standards of institutions. Humble institutions so that they serve people. And even from the days of ancient Babylonia, Michael Hudson will point out, the kings that acquired power on the basis of forgiving debts. And that is an example of such a mercy. Sorry, go ahead, Nance.
No, I was completing your argument in my head. It was debt and Graeber and this and that. And Haas, thank you for hanging out with us, man. It's been a pleasure to listen to you. And I think you've said a lot that I think I enthusiastically agree with. And the things that I don't enthusiastically agree with are unimportant right now, right? Hopefully this opens a dialogue that we can have some backs and forths. This notion of cybernetic populism, or even like a cybernetic subjectivity. You were just asking, what is the people? I think that's an exciting question. I like to ask, what is a people? And what I mean by that is like, I really want to investigate subjectivity itself and like, what is the human? And so you're focused on language groups and language itself and the code. Again, it's very exciting, but I do think I'm maybe less certain of projections that it seems like your project makes. But ultimately, I do think I'm seeing some interesting contradictions. And I think, I don't know, at this point, I guess I'm just less certain of any existing political structures kind of accomplishing any human goals. Like, we want structures and systems to serve human goals, but I don't really know if those exist or if we ourselves would have to innovate them. But again, I do bring it back to this question of kind of language and the code and how we use it and how it uses us, and kind of just trying to situate us as the subject first.
Right. And it's like, you mentioned what is a people in the first place. And it's like, when you inquire on that question, you can't help but draw, apparently at least, radically inhuman conclusions. Like, we are not subjects as individuals. There is this other subject, which seems to be almost, using us as puppets to fulfill its goals. And if you look at social media, it's this very, very bizarre feedback loops between, what is social media? Is it individuals all, talking to each other? No, it's all of us participating in talking to something that is radically not an individual, right? It's like, well, when you have 55,000 likes or something on X, is that 55,000 people agreeing with you, or did you awaken? It's almost like a ritual. Like, we are paying tribute and acquiescing to our acknowledgement of that this is true at a level that is not worth one individual, but at least 55,000 of them, right? Which is, what kind of subject is that? What is that addressing? Who is that addressed to? It's like, and then, there's so many different threads that this you can kind of connect, right? So first of all, obviously there's Heidegger and this idea of Dasein, but you know what? I'm a materialist and a horrible reductionist, and I like to think about the historical context. And Heidegger is not only emerging in the era of consumerism, where feedback loops as far as mass desire and choices are becoming integrated economically, but also the strange syzygy described by Michael Hudson of superimperialism. The United States is simultaneously a debtor, it's in debt, but it's also a creditor. It's the world's biggest creditor. And that seems homologous with what we're talking about here. If we're talking about this kind of cybernetic subjectivity, if we would call it that, right? Subjectivity, the word kind of refers to cybernetic subjectivity is an inherently contradictory term, by the way, because what did the founder of Cybernetic say? He said, the purpose of a system is what it does. It's not what it was intended to do. It's not, what it should do. It's what it actually does, right? So cybernetic subjectivity actually just refers to something objective, actually. That's what makes it so paradoxical. But something objective that simultaneously possesses the quality of subjectivity in the strict sense of self-referentiality, right? Or referentiality towards something which it itself participates in or participates within it, right? And, that seems like homologous to this creditor-debtor dynamic that Hudson describes for U.S. superimperialism. It seems awfully proximate not only to Heidegger's idea of Dasein, but there's an element in Dugin, which you see with his notion of different Daseins and logos. What is a logos? Well, people say Dugin is all very mystical and impenetrable, but he's really just describing that contradiction in a lot of ways, right? And then you can also, finally, our favorite is Nick Land, who finally, in his genius, identified capital as this such subject. Right. The MCM process. Also, Lacan was there before Nick Land, because Lacan is the one who said that Marx was the first to discover the symptom. And why is that? Because the symptom, according to Lacan, was this circuit of jouissance that yields the structure, right? That yields surplus jouissance, right? And Marx somehow discovered that in his understanding and reading of political economy, where capital is MCM. It's this kind of self-perpetuating process, which Lacan identifies with the symptom. Yeah, the loop. So
the churn.
So in many ways, the way I think is a lot of people are asking okay, how did Dugin influence you? How did and it's well, the way I think is I'm thinking of all of these things coming together around a shared symptom, if I may. It's there's a shared theme, at least here. They're all trying to refer and give expression to the same thing, but they're not quite doing it comprehensively or clearly and fully. And my goal, the goal of my project, is to do that, right? To really get to the essence of what is driving the development of thought, and the way that it is. I'm not necessarily a Duginist. I'm not dogmatically committed to every position Dugin has, but I just recognize his significance as he is evidence of the fact that these things are coming together for people around the world in very diverse and different ways. And I find that worth engaging with.
Great answer, man. And I think that's a perfect wrap on this segment. And it was actually kind of funny because it's if you say Lacan and Žižek, Mikey's going to appear on the channel. And then sure enough, here he is. We've summoned him, and we'll be right back, everybody, after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We're about to get into the triangle of essentialism, Mikey's defense of Žižek. And I think probably we'll get to talk a little bit more about Western versus Eastern Marxism, because that necessarily comes up with Mikey's defense of Slavoj. We'll be right back.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Theory Underground exists to cultivate the conditions necessary for a working class intellectual renaissance that goes beyond old political categories or other identitarian niches. At TU, autodidact workers with earbuds and professionals who see no future in existing institutions or movements are able to challenge their doxa and develop an understanding of the situation we are in.
If you subscribe at theoryunderground.com, you'll get access to a package of courses, including my Intro to Fault Line Theory, which includes Intro to Nick Land and Intro to Slavoj Žižek. These courses are being woven with the 3 courses that take place on a month-to-month basis, spread out throughout the year of 2025. Those courses are 12 Core Concepts and the Fundamental Problems with the Situation Today with social theorist David McKerracher, 12 Essential Political Thinkers with political theorist Benjamin Studebaker, and The Philosophy of Nature with philosopher Nina Power.
The way these all get woven together at a deeper and more meta level is through the ongoing research seminars led by David McKerracher, Benjamin Studebaker, and Michael Downs, where they engage with one another's work by sharing developments from their own perspectives, theory, and research.
If you subscribe at higher levels and support our work, we'll support your development with bespoke teaching. Alone and unaided, we struggle to grasp our situation in its fullness and formulate a meaningful response. By working together and pooling our energies, we can do better. Join us at theoryunderground.com/subscribe.
There'll be 2 kinds of people in 10 years. Those who said, I knew all along Theory Underground was going to make this huge difference. Those are the people that are like Nance, who were on the sidelines at one point and then said, nah, I'm going to get in. I'm going to roll up my sleeves and I'm going to go hard. And then there's another kind of person, a person who waits in the wings, collects receipts, and who will say in 10 years, oh yeah, I was there. I saw that happen. And then they'll gossip monger. Listen, if you want to get involved, get involved. But if you're going to sit there in the bleachers, well, here's some popcorn. I hope you have fun.